definitely the conversation will continue. We move from the general to the specific, probably where the action is. And we also move from the West to the BRICs. We will have two scholars from BRIC countries. So this morning and today we heard a lot about Western leadership, breaking the BRICs. Now maybe it's time to also listen what the BRICs have in mind related to this. Okay, so we have three top scholars. I'm not going to present them in details. You have on the leaflet here. Please stick to 15 minutes. We are a bit delayed in the schedule. So 15 minutes and then we have half an hour for discussion. We begin with Thomas Risse, professor at Freie University Berlin and Transworld partner. Please, Thomas, to you.
Thank you. Does this work? Okay, good. Yeah, thank you, Raffaele. I want to make, you have to police me at some point. Yeah, okay, good. So, I want to make 3 big points. And the third point is subdivided in all kinds of other points, and when I run out of time, I just stop, okay? So, the first is a reflection on the title of this panel, Developing Synergies Between Security, Democracy, and Human Rights. And I've stumbled on the word synergies. Because my first point is it ain't that simple. The title of this panel seems to suggest that security, democracy, human rights all go together and everybody is happy ever after. In the long run, I would say, yes, that is true. From an international relations perspective, we know about the democratic peace. So if you have consolidated democracies, they don't fight each other, the security dilemma is gone. Bruce Russell told us everything about this, etc. So in that sense, yes, in the long run. But, and the discussion about the Arab Spring, about Syria, etc. that we just had reminds us of that, the transition to democracy, liberalization processes are intrinsically messy. And they're not only intrinsically messy inside a country, they are also intrinsically messy for the foreign policies of countries. In fact, we know by now that actually transition processes are ones where the danger of interstate war actually increases. So, in the long run, there might be a nice synergy between peace, security, democracy, and human rights, and they could all come in one package. But in the short run, it's very unclear whether there are these synergies or whether there are certain really goal conflict, and that brings me exactly to my second point. My second point is about the West. I'm not, at this point, I don't deconstruct the West, I just take it as is. You know, and I want to talk about the experiences we have in terms of promoting democracy and human rights. And I'm coming back to this question, security on the one hand versus human rights, democracy on the others. Now, the story about Western promotion of democracy and human rights is a decidedly mixed bag. On the one hand, the EU usually celebrates itself with the success of Eastern enlargement as probably the biggest experiment or success, if you want, of democracy promotion ever. Now, but, reminder, I agree with that argument as long as we talk about democratic consolidation. The transition process, the liberalization process in Eastern Europe had very little to do with the EU and Eastern enlargement. We can now talk for another 5 hours about the end of the Cold War and how it came about. But I mean, the EU as such was not very effective during the democratic transition, when the revolutions in Eastern Europe took place. Now, if we look at more contemporary efforts, and this includes both the US and the EU, if you look, for example, at the European neighborhood, there the efforts at democracy promotion and human rights are decidedly less successful. One showcase is the Southern Caucasus. Now, I realize that there is a big other guy on the block called Russia, and that the EU and the US on the one hand and Russia on the other hand are on cross purposes here, but you cannot blame everything in this case on Russia. We talked about this before, and I'm coming now back to the security issue. Let's talk about the Middle East and the Arab Spring. I said that in the closed meeting yesterday already. That is an utmost disaster. We can now analyze whether the West was simply irrelevant, or whether actually the West was on the other side, mainly backing up autocratic regimes, despite all the talk about human rights and democracy. And I include both the US and the EU. They're guilty on both sides for this. So in that sense, in the Middle East, neither the EU nor the US ever so far has seriously promoted human rights or democracy. It has always privileged stability, and that meant so far the stability prior to the Arab Spring, the stability of Arab autocracies over human rights and democracies despite all the liberal rhetoric. As a result, my fear is that currently the West has lost a lot of credibility in the Middle East, and I'm not sure that we can actually make up for this. Now, let me be very clear on this point. My concern or my demand is not that the West should always privilege human rights and democracy over security and stability. I think that is nonsensical, and it's also not a good foreign policy. But one has to be aware of trade-offs. And the worst thing the West can do is developing a grandiose rhetoric that is in the end not backed up, or where the peoples on the ground who are on the streets, who wait for their liberal partners elsewhere to help them, where they then feel completely betrayed. So in foreign policy, it's always about conflicting goals and striking a balance, but one has to be aware of that. And in my view, the consequence would be, rather than continuing embarking about grandiose rhetoric, pursue more modest goals. And we could spell, if you want, I can spell this out for the current situation, what that means vis-a-vis Egypt, what it would mean vis-a-vis Tunisia, etc. Libya, I'm not so sure, and Syria, I leave to you guys to discuss. So my big point for the West now is there are situations where security concerns do not go hand in hand with promoting human rights and democracies. There are some synergies, but there are also clear trade-offs, and one has to be aware of this. So my big last point now goes to the West, the BRICs, and human rights democracy. The first one is, and I just want to emphasize a point that Madame Dassou made just a minute ago. My first point here is, when it comes to human rights and democracy, etc., it is really impossible to treat the BRICs as a unitary actor. It's a social construction, nothing else. It doesn't exist as an actor in that kind of area, and of course that has a lot to do with regime type. I mean, you have some consolidated democracies. You have India and South Africa. You have an authoritarian state that tries to, China, that tries to, in my view, become the Prussia of the 19th century in the 21st century, which is an interesting social experiment. The question is whether you can combine authoritarian rule with a certain rule of law that particularly secures property rights, but without human rights. So that's the big That's the big social experiment that I think China is embarking upon, and that puts them, of course, on a different side. I can talk about Russia for a long time as a sort of what we could call an electoral democracy, essentially without much of rule of law, etc. So all I'm saying is this is a very heterogeneous bunch when it comes to human rights and democracy, as a result of which it's very, very unclear whether we're talking about the relationship between the West and the BRICs in that kind of area. At this point, I do want to make a comment, though, to the discussion we had so far. I detect a language here in this room and in all kinds of other debates about the rise of China debate is always my favorite. It seems to me that in the West, be it in the US, the EU, in Paris, Berlin, London, or here in Rome, we always are in between a rather paternalistic attitude. I call that the socialization perspective. We have these multilateral institutions, and we, the West, of course, build them, and now the issue is socialize them in. They have to become like us. And if I hear these things expand the West, and I mean, Brzezinski is somewhere in between. I mean, it's part of a realist containment strategy vis-a-vis China. It has very little to do with Russia, actually, in my view. It's sort of, I mean, it's in between. That's the other side. The other side is the containment perspective. And you see it with regard to China. At that point, everybody says South China Sea, right? This is where you have this containment stuff going on. And I think what it means is that we, as the West, haven't really come to grips with a situation in which there are emerging powers. They might not have a program. They might not really know what they are doing. They might not have a world vision for the rest. But they are there, and they are active, and they're starting to get active. And I'm coming back to the human rights issues. What we need, I think, what we desperately need to do is guard our language and think about how we relate to the emerging powers. And it was said by, I think it was Sean in the previous panel. It's not just the BRICs, it's also Turkey, of course. By the way, you guys in the early thing you were constructed out of Europe. Did you notice? So may I please construct you in again? So, I just wanted. Anyway, but I mean Indonesia, Singapore, Argentina, Mexico, etc., etc. You know. I just wanted to make sure, and the point is, and here I come back now to the human rights issues. I think human rights and liberal democracy are constitutive for the West. I mean, this is what we are about, okay? And there's absolutely no reason to give up on that program. I don't see that, and we should not. If we give up on that program, and revert back to the 19th century, just as a multipolar world, and we do balance of power, and we throw away our values, nobody will take us seriously anymore anyway. But I think the challenge is to notice that we are not the only ones on the block, and that there are other people who might actually have different understandings what it means to promote human rights. I give you an example. When we in the West think human rights democracy, all we think is civil liberties and political liberties, the individual human rights. A lot of the emerging, intermediate, or whatever kind of powers bring the development agenda back into the human rights agenda. And there is not a good Western response to this so far. You know, and that would be actually an issue where I think if you want, a true dialogue could develop. I mean, I'm not suggesting we should give up, the West should give up its understanding of human rights, but we should understand. Okay, 3 more minutes. Okay, I'll be very brief on the rest. So I think there is in my view, a real room for dialogue, and for us as the West also to be a little bit more humble, given our really lack of success, our double standards that we use all the time in the field of human rights and democracy. So now I cut out, I wanted to talk about limited statehood, about responsibility to protect, about emerging norm of individual criminal responsibility. If you want, just ask questions and I go into this. I want to make one final point that I find really interesting because it connects to something we discussed this morning on the issue of interregionalism. One of the most interesting developments right now in the human rights arena is that a lot, not actually the BRICs, but other states in the various regions of the world are trying to integrate the human rights agenda into regional organizations. You can see this in Southern Africa with the SADC. You can see this in Latin America, where actually the OAS is now pushing both Mercosur and the Andean community to integrate the human rights agenda. And I think I just wanted to flag, and even, I mean, this is always, you know, Asia is always but even in Asia, you see in ASEAN, you see a push by countries like Indonesia again, Thailand, etc., pushing this agenda. And I think this is, I mean, now I'm talking more toward the EU, because that's something the EU ought to care about. This is a very interesting development, and I think if we talk about interregionalism in the way we did it this morning, these kind of issues could be included there. So I'll shut up at this point.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Thomas. We immediately move to the second speaker, Dmitri Trenin, Director, Carnegie Moscow Center, and member of the advisory board of Transworld. Please.
Thank you, Raffaele. It's great to be on the advisory board. Like Thomas, I spent some time looking at the title and wondering what I should say about that. And frankly, some of my thoughts and ideas were very much the same as those of Thomas, so I will just check them and then go down the list. I think the first time that I remember that human rights and democracy were, during the Cold War, were linked to security was the attempt by Jimmy Carter to deal with the Soviet Union by at the same time advancing a program of huge cuts in nuclear weapons and at the same time promoting human rights within the Soviet Union. Well, that effort failed. And 2 years later, Jimmy Carter signed the Seoul II Treaty in Vienna with Leonid Brezhnev, and then did something that no one had expected him to. He came up to Brezhnev and hugged him and kissed him, which was an interesting development in those days. I agree with you, Thomas, that democracy and human rights build the foundation of trust that's fundamental for stable peace. You cannot have stable peace until and unless you have trust. And you only have trust in the modern world, at least empirically, when you have democratic regimes. I mean, Europe and the United States and several other countries that have that situation. I also agree with you that so countries can have nuclear weapons like Britain and France, but they will never think. I mean, you would not think that those weapons would be a problem for those countries, for either of those countries, or for their allies and other democracies. Another thing I would like to highlight is that the end of the Cold War was also the end of the communist system and the beginning of the democratization process in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. I also agree with you that democratization is stabilizing, inherently destabilizing, and you just need to look at the experience of the former Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and a number of other cases. So when an authoritarian regime leaves its place, a lot of conflicts, a lot of controversies are set loose. And any democratizing country will have to deal with those. And that is very messy, as you suggested. I would also want to say that democratization is a very long process. And it's even longer and even less predictable when it proceeds on its own. It was one thing to have democracy, if you like, imposed by an occupying army, by an ally who protected you against the bogeyman next door. And it's a totally different thing to have a democratization process when essentially you're not allied, not allied to anyone, you're not integrated. You have to do that on your own. I would also say that attempts at democratization, and your point about humility, I think, is absolutely right here. Attempts at democratization in places like Iraq and Afghanistan were pathetic failures. And we need to keep that in mind as we proceed. I would add Libya here. I mean, the focus has long shifted away from Libya, but the things in Libya are not nice. And they're not going to be very nice for some time. Again, I'm not pointing fingers, but I think I'm trying to strengthen your point about the need to be humble. Sometimes attempts to enhance security may lead to war. We have not mentioned it yet, but the war between Russia and Georgia back in 2008 was very much the result of some people say Solomon's decision back in Bucharest in May 2008, at the same time to bar membership action plan for Georgia, and at the same time that one day you'll be there, definitely. So that sent two wrong messages at the same time to President Saakashvili and to the Kremlin. And then you only had to wait until this whole thing would explode, and it did. And I think we were very lucky back in 2008. It could have been much worse. Because there was another guy, another person who also wanted to be part of the West and who also talked about democracy, President Yushchenko of Ukraine, who at the time of the conflict imposed, or not, he didn't impose, he just issued an order for the Russian naval ships to be searched as they entered Sebastopol or left Sebastopol. You know what happens when you start searching naval ships. The good thing was that, of course, this presidential decree was never enacted by the Ukrainian authorities. Let me also touch upon the Arab Spring situation, a little bit broader than just Syria. I think that whereas a year ago, much of the talk in this part of the world, and also in the United States, was about the Arab Spring in terms of the sweeping democratization a la Europe 1848 or Eastern Europe 1989. For many Russians who were watching it, it was more like Russia's 1917, but we just didn't know which month will be the defining month. And for some people watching it now, it looks like it's more likely to be October, Islamist October. And it doesn't make a lot of people happy, although they realize that this is where the Arab people are at this point. You give it to the people, you give the power to the masses, but then you have to accept the verdict of the masses. And sometimes it may be different from what you expect it to be. What we've seen as part of the Arab Spring was the shattering, of course, of the domestic peace in a number of places. international peace has also become more precarious. Look at Israel and Egypt. The Israelis were not, from the very start of the Arab Spring, I think they were much, I wouldn't say they were closer to the Russians, but they were much ahead of the Russians in terms of branding the Arab Spring a great Islamist revolution. And as people who were placed in the midst of the Arab world, they felt it so much closer. So this is something that that puts democratization, not democracy, but democratization and security and stability at cross purposes. You have to deal with that. So I believe, we discussed Syria just a few moments ago. If you wish, we can revisit the situation in Syria. I still want to confine my remarks within the allotted time. Let me pass to the issue of Russia's relations with the West and the issue of democracy, or rather lack of democracy in Russia. I do not quite know what an electoral democracy is. I think you know a democracy when you see it. Russia is not a democracy. It's a free country in many ways, but it's not. It's just not a democracy. That's all. It's very important to get the right approach, I think, toward countries such as Russia, so as not to undermine one's own security in the quest for more democracy in other countries. I think that it would be best to recognize several things. First, that each country's people will blaze its own way toward democracy. I'm fully convinced that anywhere in the world and everywhere in the world, democracy in various ways and forms will be the method of governance because autocracies are out of tune, increasingly out of tune with the complexity of today's world. Autocracies simply don't have a chance. They don't have a chance in Russia. They don't have a chance elsewhere. I see them on the way out, and I would want to stress that it is the job of each and every people to make sure that they own their country and they participate in running their country. Democracy, of course, is much more than elections. Elections can lead to the worst authoritarian governments in the world. It was, I don't want to mention that, but some of the most vicious totalitarian regimes in this part of the world came to power through formally democratic means. So democracy is not, electoral democracy does not give you exactly. So this is the point. Electoral democracy is not what you should be looking for. It's something else. You do not have a democracy until and unless, in my view, you have a sizable middle class. Unless and until you have people who have a stake. Unless and until you have people who are prepared to participate, not just to cast their vote once every few years, but to be able to participate. One of the most heartening things in the recent Russian election was we actually voted for, we voted twice. We voted for the president of the Russian Federation, and at the same time we voted for the members of municipal councils, borough councils, very low, the lowest of the low levels of municipal government. And I was, of course, as like all voters in Russia, I was issued a long list of names of people I didn't know anything about. But I looked up their birth dates, and around half of those people were younger than my kids. And I thought, this is it. This is the big move. Not, Putin. Putin will go at some point. I mean, like all people would. But this is a sea change in society with younger people who until very recently just shunned all electoral processes that didn't bother to vote. They were now prepared not only to vote or watch other people, monitor other people voting, but they were prepared to engage at the very lowest rung in the system. 3 minutes. Thank you so much. My second point would be that openness, integration, inclusion works so much better than their opposites. Whether it's containment, whether it's the Iron Curtain, whether it's sanctions, whether it's autarky, openness works best. Whether it's Iran or Russia. The Soviet Union, by the way, did not die because of the arms race with the United States. The Soviet Union could have continued, at least for a couple of decades. The Soviet Union died of the ultimate détente with the West. When the walls of when it was clear that all this system that they built would serve no useful purpose, then they started asking about the need to have a permanent martial law in the country. So that was so in my view, soft power beats hard power when it comes to democracy and human rights. And lastly, military involvement on behalf of human rights and democracy needs to be, if there is a need for that, it should be a short introduction to a long process of rehabilitation. And it's not like you intervene, you let somebody kill the vicious dictator, and then you lose interest in a country. It's the responsibility that continues. It's the responsibility to protect and see through the long process, if you have the stamina for that. Otherwise, it's not, in my view, a very good thing. And very lastly, let me just comment. I may have another minute or so. I was struck by one recurrent theme in this conversation. That is, for the first time now that the West has lost its dominance in the world, or something like that, with the advent of BRICs. Well, come on. 30 years ago, there was a thing called the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a mighty, long competition against the United States and the West. And it looked at some points in that competition, let's say 1975, Vietnam, or 1979, Iran, like the Soviet Union was winning. It's a good thing that the Soviet people, the Russian people and other people, shook off communism. It's a great thing for the world. But it's not the first time that the West finds itself in a... I was very struck by that. And why don't I stop here? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dmitri. We now move to our third presentation by Ranabir Samaddar, Director of Mahanirban Calcutta Research Group. Please.
What I am going to present briefly is not a BRICS viewpoint or an Indian viewpoint, but what, for lack of better terms, could be called a post-colonial viewpoint of what I hear here. And something that struck me even yesterday is the competitive or the adversarial tone and the tune in which the whole thing is discussed, because back home the idea of complementarity is stronger than the adversarial terms of reference, and partly probably it has to do with we did not suffer, or we were not subjects of Cold War in as much as this region was. And I think also it has to do a lot with how one conceives of a region, because when I was coming here, I was thinking of what do I have to tell about transatlantic region. You know, I'm completely a foreigner to that. And I had read a book called Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, or I'm quite sure many of you have read that book. So there are other histories of Atlantic relations. In the same way that during the lunchtime, I was telling some of my friends that in India there is so much interest about Eurasia. And the emerging interest is not about transatlantic, but more about Eurasia, the different ideas about Europe's old connections with Asia, the Silk Route. There is so much interest in Silk Route. In fact, one of our finest filmmakers has made a film on Silk Route financed by the UNESCO. It's on the UNESCO site. There is also a rekindling of interest in Mackinder's old arguments about Europe stretching into Asia, or the other way around, Asia stretching into Europe, and Europe be seen as the kind of peninsular end of a huge landmass. Now, so this is all I'm trying to say, therefore, that to judge a new phenomenon, one has to discard at times the old glasses. And to appreciate what the new phenomenon is all about, to do that with the old pair of glasses is not always the best of the things. And in terms of social science, in natural science, this is easier because we know we need a new instrument, we know we need new labs, we know we would need new technologies. But in social science, the techniques of reading what the present is enormously contrived. It has very little scientific precision, and history at times helps. Therefore, recalling 19th century, or for that matter, if one were to think of it a bit more rigorously, maybe the mid-16th century seems to be a more appropriate one. Why does there one need to have always a universal set of rules? Why should we mean that there should be a global regime of rule of law? Why can't we admit plurality in the whole thing? So these are all kinds of questions for which we do not have time. But I hope that we adopt a much more pluralistic framework in order to understand what is happening. Now, this brings me again, as a social historian, to the second point. You know, Max Weber, in fact, again, this is, you would be much more educated on Max Weber than I. But Max Weber was someone who believed in what he called actually the monotheism of capital, that there is only one way in which capital can grow, that there are not several ways. Max Weber, in fact, thought that Asians could never be citizens. Why? Because he said that the type of urban mentality that you need to bring about an organic city and become a citizen is possible only, not only with the monotheistic ideas, but also with the monotheistic conception of organizing societies. And therefore, though Max Weber towards the end of his life declared that he wanted to study Hinduism and all that, but I don't think that that would have given him a greater insight into the problem, because religion had little to do with that. But I think this is important to discard once for all this idea that the growth of capital is linked to a monotheistic culture. Indeed, Arrighi, before he died, wrote a fascinating book called Adam Smith in Beijing. I'm quite sure students of economic history or international political economy must have seen this. And again, Arrighi's own argument was that even Adam Smith, in this entire 6 volumes of Wealth of Nations, spoke of 2 possible ways. One, he said, of course, is the market way, the hidden hand of God. But Arrighi also spoke of a much more social way, which you find in both India and China, I'm quite sure, in other countries. And there is a deeper social involvement in the debate about how to bring about a growth in production, what will be the role of public institutions, how does one plan the change of a society. And this is happening because simply that the countries which are known as BRICs or members of G20, etc., have now the advantage in terms of understanding the good and bad of the Euro-American continent. There is also another question about adopting a new framework. Now, something which is very relevant is being discussed, that how do we appreciate democracy? And there are theorists who say democracy first, rights come second. But I, as a human rights thinker, as an activist, have always held rights come first and then democracy comes as a result of rights. Now, this is not simply a chicken and egg question. I think this has enormous consequences in terms of the international approach. The international managers of peace, they always try to restore quote and unquote failed states. And they do so by restoring democracy without recognizing rights. Now, for one moment, allow me to just drop the word human, because human rights is a specific ideological term. But let's stick to the much more classical term, which is rights. And rights, they are not a result of democracy. They are a result of collective claim making. This is as old as one of the finest social science findings. One can read lots of history about how rights have come about. One can read Charles Tilly. One can read Barrington Moore's account about the growth of rights. And rights clearly are a result of popular claim making. People who come on the streets, they demand their rights. The claims are recognized only de jure as rights. Socially, they are recognized as much more as acknowledgement of justice and not of rights. Justice is, in fact, a much more profound concept in all the developing countries than rights. Rights are only people, I mean, in India, again, once again, if one were to study the growth of rights in India, one would see how rights are recognized as only as an acknowledgement of something which is just, something which means dignity. Dignity, even in Latin America, much like in India, is a much more profound concept than rights. Rights tell only half of the thing, but justice, in fact, takes us much, longer. So I think these are my initial comments. So to summarize my point about why do we need to change our glasses, why I'm saying that with old glasses we cannot see what is happening, is simply because we have to discard Max Weber once for all. This idea that there is a monotheism of capital, there is one single way in which commodity production, law, modern way of ruling, consolidating governance, new ways of administering human relations, political relations, trade relations, that there is no one single way. If there were one, that age is over. The second point to recount is, again, that there are different histories of region making. In as much as there is a white Atlantic and the Atlantic has been white, but there are enough studies to show that there had been a black Atlantic. The black Atlantic, where people traveled from, let's say, Senegal to Martinique, comes to France and speaks of how to remake Africa. I'm talking of Frantz Fanon, but there are many others who know that how African liberationist ideology came about. Or, as I said, people speak of Eurasia, which is again a different way of looking at things. My second group of observation is that if that is the case, that we need a new framework or a new set of principles to understand how the world is changing, I think we have to take into account two more things. One is that in defining rights, it is not only the politics of the street which is counting today, in as much as it counted in Cairo and elsewhere, but also the word that unfortunately we did not hear. We heard of regions, but what about nation states? It seems, the assumption is that for the rest of the world, the nation state is not part in it, that the nation state only makes states arrogant, that they make states let's say, respectful to international law, etc., etc. But I do not think that that hypothesis is right. I do not think that in that sense what is called in political philosophy as the Machiavellian moment, that moment when there is republicanism, when the country organizes into some kind of a collective citizenry, makes its claim, one of the results of which is the development rights, that the nation's right to develop, that the nation's right to escape certain traps of underdevelopment, unequal exchange, and all that we know had happened in the last century. Now, how do we appreciate the expansion of, therefore, the frontier of rights? And I see in the emergence of BRICs, but BRICs is not really the main point of there are other developing countries. I see the main point is that nations do have rights to develop, but this is not considered in its significance, in its importance by whether it is the EU or it is the Transatlantic Coalition Alliance or whatever name is given to it. I think that the expansion of the frontier of rights is an enormously important question, and I clearly think that the liberal framework, unfortunately, I do not agree with you that the liberal framework is adequate for that. I think if that were to be so, or if that liberal framework has to be taken seriously, then that has to be redefined. There are many people who are trying to define, redefine. There are many liberal philosophers who have gone back to the question of justice. Whether one formal political outlook will be finally, authentic on that I cannot say, and that I don't think is an important point. But the more important point is that we have to appreciate that rights are enormously expanding in terms of their frontiers. At one level, we can all say UDHR is the basis. But if you take UDHR, take from Article 1, the way its interpretation has expanded, the way people, for example, migrants' rights, refugee rights, the right of the labor to move from one country to another, the way in which labor and the life of a commodity is taking transitory form, something whose certain parts are made in Calcutta, traded across to Bangkok, goes to Shanghai, comes back to Calcutta, and all kinds of migratory labor is involved in that. So where do we place these kinds of new rights? Do we think that the nation-state framework is inadequate? Or, as many countries still think, we need that framework. We cannot surrender that framework. If we surrender that framework, who will protect us then? After all, for the citizens, it is only the state, nation-state framework, which, fine enough, has to be continuously democratized. But that, at one level, I'm not saying that's all the levels, that remains the defense of the citizen. Therefore, there are many critical theorists, critical democratic, political philosophers who say that the liaison between globalization and democracy has been a dangerous one. It has not been good for the citizens of the country. But we cannot say whether globalization is good or bad. These are objective things, so no point in taking a kind of a value judgment on the whole thing. But I think it is important how one negotiates one way forward in terms of deepening the rights. Finally, I think one of the questions that the way BRICS has come up, or even if we forget BRICS, but even in my own country and region, South Asia, things are coming up in terms of rights, is the question of autonomy. Sovereignty is something which is a much more graded one. There are so many discussions, even in jurist circles, on how can sovereignty be shared. And when we say sovereignty can be shared, we are not only speaking of sovereignty to be shared by certain international partners, but we are thinking of sovereignty to be shared internally, much more pluralistically, in a much more complex of institutions. There will be institutions, there will be countries who will be taking their positions in an autonomous manner, which is not sovereignty, which is neither subservience, but somewhere in between, which is undefined. Till today, in terms of law, what exactly we mean by sovereignty? Do we mean a sharing of, what do we mean by autonomy? With all the international principles, legal principles, political principles of autonomy, we still do not know what it exactly means. But one can see that the way the language of rights is expanding, the way the world is becoming much more plural, and by plural I mean a combination of singularities, which will be playing complementary parts, which will be much more dialogic in their relation to one another. And they don't have to, and therefore my response will be, why should we have to? We have too much burden in cleaning our own dishes. Why can't we leave it to others to leave? I mean, there are certain people who will assume that they have the mantle of God, so they will fix all the responsibilities on us. But we are fortunate that there are certain others who are much more level-headed and to know that after all, God has not given us infinite powers to solve the problems. So let us leave certain problems either to the Almighty or to the local people, who, if they want, will fight it out, who, if they agree to the regional ways in which peacemaking is going on, and I think there are, I mean, if you take the way India and China, and I will conclude with that, I think this is one of the finest of lessons, how even with certain contradictory relation between two countries, how relations can be much more peacefully negotiated. The way refugee problem of the Tibetans, Chinese would not like the way Indians are treating Tibetans. India has a commitment to Tibetans, but this has not led to war. This has not led to conflict. This has led to, in fact, even more rounds of dialogue. So how do we dialogically see the complementarities of the world, the singularities of the world, I think is a question that comes out only of long colonial experience. And that's why I said it's a post-colonial view. It's neither a BRICS view nor an Indian view. Thank you.
Much, Ranabir. I think these were three extremely stimulating and sophisticated presentations. Now we have a good half an hour for discussion. Please introduce yourself, and also just an encouraging, I would like to encourage students to be part of the discussion. The reason why we held this conference here in the university is to have a diversified and pluralist audience, including students. Okay, please.
Thanks, Thomas Weiss, Charles University in Prague. Thank you very much for these insights. I kind of come from a country which has got type of a post-colonial experience, and I kind of disagree with you. It might be, I might just be thinking in the box, but it connected to me very much to what Dmitri said. The thing that if we once start doing somewhere, such as Libya, we just have to see them through. Well, yes, in the ideal world, sure. But does it mean that we should leave it alone, like in Syria? I mean, both options are bad. The fact that we can't do everything doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything, I believe. And coming back to you, what you said about the rights is nice. But the problem always is which rights. And unless you really draw the rights from a god, you will have to come down to the individuals. And the problem of some of the countries that we are talking here about is that they, and what my country kind of believed it was doing, was that the regime that I grew up in was that it believed it knew what rights are and what good is for the people without really asking them. And we have countries in the world that kind of build on these Asian rights or Asian values without really going down to the people and asking them whether they believe in these values. So what is the regime that kind of has the substance out of the liberal democracy? Thank you.
Anne-Marie Le Gloanec, Sciences Po. I'm addressing your comments, which I thought were very illuminating and interesting, and yet I was a little bit puzzled, and I would like to ask a question. I am very much aware of the, wary about the arrogance of the West in very many ways, which comes back under other guises. You said, why a universal set of rules? I mean, this is one of your major questions. And I counter back, how do we make sure that we will be speaking the same language?
Cesare Merlini, Yai, and Brookings. My third question, I'll move it first because it's related to the same issues that Anne-Marie Clone has raised. I was also puzzled by your comments about the universality of human rights. And let me bring it a little further. You link this suggestion of common or universal values to monotheism. I have some problems with that because the universality comes from the cultural string of cosmopolitanism. which is there before monotheism. So I think that, though I agree with you that we have to be careful in not considering universal what is Western. I agree with that. We have to be open to a dialogue between the Western reading of universal right, but the universal right are part of Greek culture first, but I hesitate to enter a subject I know very little about, but I think also in Indian culture, cosmopolitanism is present. My first question I had was, first about the title of this session. In my view, the real triad is not security, democracy, and human rights. Economy must be brought in. The triad is, because, you know, if you want to have a dialogue with the BRICs, economy is part of the triad, inevitably, and comes second. Security, economy, and then third, what? Democracy, human rights. I strongly agree with Dmitri Trenin about his critical remarks about electoral democracy. I think maybe in this project, Natalie, you should make an effort to really take distance with this very strongly American-influenced kind of semantic about democracy. I think that democracy is an insufficient word to describe what we are talking about, the institution and so on and so forth. A substitute, my suggestion is rule of law. Rule of law, yeah. So the triad, in my view, should be security, economy, and rule of law. Rule of law is much more composite subject than democracy is because of the complex nature of institution.
Thank you very much. Okay, maybe a last question and then the audience. Anna? Yeah, I think.
Thank you. I'm Anna Zhang, PhD candidate at Louis. I have two questions. First of all, thank you very much for this very inspiring presentations. I enjoyed it immensely. First is about changes that are less perceived in the West. It's just that I think that US or the EU do realize that there are changes taking place in different parts of the world now. For example, in the morning we talked about the participation of US in EAS, and but that is very different because US probably if it's not the first, it's very rare the US participates in a regime that is already made before. For example, in NATO and APEC, US had been involved in the initial design of those regimes, whereas EAS, they were kind of more or less invited later after, and I don't know, for different reasons. I mean, I don't want to discuss that, but still, I have to agree with Professor Risse that I was surprised with the language used in the room. It's just that it's always we, and then I'm really a bit puzzled who is really we, because I don't know if I would describe myself as we, meaning the East. I don't know what that entails. So and then so I don't know if it's only the language or it's really the perception. And but in general, my question would be how can the West promote its ideas of liberal democracy and human rights without being paternalistic? In reality, how can that take place? Not losing those goals, but still socializing with other parts of the world. How? In what ways can it be done? And my second question is, yeah. No? Yeah, my second question is about, Professor Risse mentioned about like different concepts of like how different, like for example, human rights or democracy are perceived in different parts of the world. But I think also priorities do matter as well, because especially in countries in transition, they say, we are not denouncing the importance of rights, but then it's just that for us, development comes first. And there they actually refer to economic development. And then even like the extreme case of like North Korea, like I once heard like ambassador of Democratic People's Republic of Korea, like he meant like, yeah, I am aware, I am familiar with the discussion and the topic, but security of regime comes before. So like in the end, like can it be allowed that like certain countries in certain like states of development can have different, like those priorities, can they change? Or like, or is it like just, it will be just maintained even after time passes by?
Much. Okay, now I want to give the chance to the presenter. I think we should go the reverse order. So Ranabir, why don't you start?
First about the question of responsibility, when I said that not all the peoples of the world have the global responsibilities, they are fortunate. It doesn't mean that there is no principle of responsibility. I do agree that sovereignty brings in its own notion of responsibility, membership of United Nations. So I think one has to stick to what the UN does, if there is a regional association. But the idea that there will be a coalition of the willing who are ready to become the crusaders, go anywhere on earth and fix up all kinds of troubles is something which really seems bizarre to me. It has nothing to do with responsibility. It is rather claiming the world to be yours. I disagree that it means responsibility. I mean, if there is a pan-Arab League, if there is a Security Council resolution, you see, I think what it leads us to a much more important problem, do we stick to the dialogic rule, which is much more time protracted, which is much more, which needs patience, but which also needs something which someone referred to Greece, which is an ancient idea, which is the idea of a permanent plebiscite. That on each issue of dispute, we need to discuss, we cannot do anything so quickly. And this is much more important, and that means a greater, sense of responsibility. I never spoke of Asian rights or Asian values. I do not believe in that. And therefore, when I spoke of rights, I said that the expansion of the frontier of rights is very important. Take the classic history of rights written by someone like Marshall, the history of social citizenship. Now, Marshall traces the history of citizenship of the West in as far as it was a political, electoral, civic citizenship, but he said that the entire 20th century, and this was written in 1950s, is a history of people getting trade union rights, association rights, all kinds of things. And then he said that is the second generation citizenship rights. It's social citizenship. Citizenship is becoming much more substantive. Individual rights doesn't make sense beyond a point. If in India or in Latin America, in Bolivia, wherever you find that indigenous people are claiming back certain things, is it perched on the plank of individual right? No. It is perched on the plank of group rights. It is perched on certain types of collectives, those collectives which are making new claims, and right to land, right to the commons is one of the most important rights on which in all the post-colonial world you find groups of people are coming out. On the other hand, if you stick to individual rights, see UDHR, where is the minority right in it? UDHR doesn't have anything to do with minority right. There are important, very authoritative histories on why Article 27, finally, it came into being the way it came into being. And even ICCPR was not adequate. After ICCPR, then we had to have an again international covenant on social and economic rights. Even that too is not enough. Now, when I say these things, all I am saying is that rights frontiers are always expanded because of collective actions. They do not expand because of democratic theory. They do not expand because of any liberal normative framework. They expand because collectives are formed on the street and they go out making their claims. That's the history of 19th century. That's the history of nations. Why, as I said, we do not always need any global system. That doesn't mean we wouldn't have a language. But that language is always the language of translation and mediation. Take 1951 Refugee Convention. India is not a signatory to Refugee Convention because India has thought that this is discriminatory. On the other hand, see India's record in giving asylum. It is one of the finest in the world. No country in South Asia has been a signatory to the 51 Convention. But on the other hand, see the Pakistan's record in terms of giving asylum to Afghan refugees is, again, 500,000 refugees for 15 years. How much UNHCR contributed? This enormous economic burden. Where is burden sharing? There's nothing. So I think it is much more important or realistic, therefore, to understand that there are different ways of looking what the international is and accepting that we have differences, that we need to have much more dialogue. And therefore, the singularities of the world are immanent. And they make the collective, they make the international. The international is not homogeneous. That is the main point that I'm trying to make here.
Thank you, Ranabir. Dmitri and then Thomas, and then we will have a final quick round of question and answer. So please.
On Syria, Thomas, I would disagree. Czechoslovakia was never a colony. It was a satellite state. I fully agree with you that doing nothing is as bad as doing bad things, as misengaging, let's put it that way. So when I look at Syria, I'm thinking about the models to be used. And I believe that the Libyan model, an outside intervention, is thankfully, at least as I see, off the table for the time being, because even those who would want to intervene see the likely costs of such intervention as forbidding. And that's a good thing. The Yemen model that Marta Dassou was talking about, I think is unlikely to be used in Syria because Syria is so much more complex as society and so much more advanced as society than Yemen is. So just removing one family even will not do the job. What do you do with the army who were shelling people, who were doing stuff? What would you do with the Alawite community? So I think that we need to come up with, i.e. the international community, i.e. the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, whatever. I think that we start with the Annan Plan. The Annan Plan is based on the assumption that any solution should be Syria-led, which is fine in the sense that it shouldn't be a solution imposed in a very crude fashion on Syria, but the Syrians will not lead today to a solution. I look at Damascus, I see they want to prevail. I look at the opposition, they have no time for Assad or the regime. They want the regime to go. So I do not see a Syrian-led solution. So what I think the international community could be doing at this point is for Russia and others who have influence in Damascus to lean real hard on Assad, to engage in a meaningful way with the opposition, and be prepared to cede a portion of power or all power in return for safe passage, in return for guarantees for the family, for the people, for the Alawites, for others. But I would also see the West leading very real hard on the opposition, first of all, to unite, because we talk about the opposition, we don't know what we're talking about. It's very much a mixed bag of unknowns. And to what extent they're capable of acting, other than giving interviews, is a big question mark. So in my view, the West needs to consolidate the opposition and present Assad with a partner in negotiations about the future of Syria. And then I would imagine both Assad and his people and the opposition people brought together, their heads knocked together, locked in a room like the late Dick Holbrooke did at Dayton, and make sure that they work out a solution, or else, essentially. And let me say finally that I believe it's doing nothing is absolutely not an option. Doing the wrong thing will be counterproductive, but it's safer to engage on the Syrian issue than to ignore it. Much safer to engage.
Thanks. Thomas, and then I mean, he will have to leave. He has a flight, so just.
Okay. Yeah, I apologize. I have to leave, so I'm not here for the final round. First, I have two comments to Ranabir. If I were a Western triumphalist, which I am not, okay, I would point out that the rights revolution is a Western concept, and also the invention of the nation state comes right out of European history. Now, including group rights, remind you, one of the first group rights were gender rights, women's rights to vote, etc. These movements were all movements in the West. Now, where comes my not-so-Western triumphalist part? And it's a criticism of the emphasis on differences. Because I do not think that the various cultures, experiences in the contemporary world are cultural containers. What we have is entangled histories. Historians call it histoire croisée. We have historical transfers. You know, we in Europe always think everything originated in Europe, including the EU. You know, we just invented the whole thing. No, if you look at the history of the European Union, the Europeans actually got a lot of ideas from the US, from Asia, etc., etc. We have these entangled experiences, you know, and that also, and this is my second point to your point, the point that you made, essentially with this othering language that we do all the time, right? The West and the BRICs. I mean, it's right there. I mean, this is the othering. This is immediate. You have othered the BRICs, right? In that sentence. And language is not innocent. Language is, I mean, I completely agree with you. You know, we had the language turn now in the humanities, social sciences, etc. We create meaning by pointing these kind of things out. But the notion of entangled histories points out to the fact that there is no, let me put it this way, Chinese civilization that is untouched, you know, by other influences, and the other way around. And once we recognize this, we actually, I would argue, we have a better way, because your main question was, how do we promote human rights and not be paternalistic? Once we recognize this, that we have these entangled experiences, and that we are picking up stuff from other cultures, and that the cultures are not sort of sealed containers, you know, that had nothing to do with each other. And globalization didn't just start in the 21st century. If you think about the various ways, I mean, you talk about the Silk Route. I mean, talking about globalization, damn it. I mean, so once we recognize this, we can also use a language that is far less paternalistic then, where we could say we do have, and I would not give up on this, I have to say, we do have a certain Western or European experience, and that has a lot to do with human rights, and that they are in the West, in the European experience, usually and historically interpreted in a pretty individualistic way. But the rights revolution, and that is the beauty of it, is open to all kinds of appropriations, you know? So you can have indigenous peoples picking up on it and developing it further. Minority rights, and the whole, I mean, if you look at the evolution of both the various domestic rights catalogs, but also the international human rights regimes, you could see that, I mean, apparently the rights revolution simply does empower people who then can claim these kind of things. And I think we, as the West, I'm othering again, therefore I always use the parenthesis here, we can make that as an offer, and then in the concrete situations like right now in the Middle East, see, okay, let's talk. You know, we can, to be very concrete, we have certain interests. We do not want, we simply do not want the Salafists in Egypt taking over. You know, at the same time, we recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood won these elections, and they were reasonably fair and free elections. You can't really disagree with that. So, at the same time, we have certain interests, and we need to communicate and say, okay, let's see whether we get together. You know, we have to do some homework on this, particularly in the EU and the US, and my sense is, by the way, currently the Obama administration is way ahead of the EU in readjusting its policies toward the Middle East. But I do believe there are ways to talk about these issues in not a paternalistic way. And also this question you had with the priorities, what you prioritize, etc. I mean, that's an issue where I think we should be very careful. I mean, that's up to the people to decide whether they need, whether they think development first, and then come some democratic institution. Partially because all of our Western theories of modernization that was used to think in certain sequences, and you end up with Sweden in the end, you know. That has been proven so empirically wrong that we can't, I mean, and we had these the long debates about external promotion, you know, should you do institutions first, or security first, or democracy first, you know, and in the end, you just throw the whole package, you know, and pick what you have. I'm rambling on. I'm done in 2 minutes. I wanted to re-emphasize 2 points that Dmitri made before I leave. The one is really this myth of Western dominance. I mean, I find that a really bizarre discussion. You could argue with some kind of argument that the 1990s were sort of a unipolar moment. But again, even then you have to make a lot of additional assumptions whether what we had was really unipolarity. I personally think these terms, polarity, etc., multipolarity, whatever you can call it, and Sean tried to sort of reinvent it somehow, do not make that much sense for the contemporary situation, and they haven't made much sense for before. But I want to re-emphasize your point that there is a certain mythology as if the West was dominant for, you know, the last centuries, right? So the other one I wanted to really emphasize is your point on the R2P. I mean, if I had some time, and I would have made exactly the same point. To think, you know, you intervene and then be done with it, that is almost tragic, you know, because these are long-term commitments, and that the problem is here, these type of long-term commitments are commitments that are very, very hard to sell in a democratic public. You know, you want to have the boys home, or the girls, right? And democratic publics have a legitimate right to be heard. You know, so always you have to have an exit strategy. An exit strategy doesn't work in these kind of long-term commitments. So I think we have that's a real dilemma of legitimacy and what actually the need on the ground is for these kind of issues. I just wanted to flag this, that this is, I see it as a real dilemma of democratic societies. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, first I need to, well, we need to say bye-bye to you. I need to apologize for those two people who asked for questions, and I really ask you to just chat during the coffee break because we are running out of time. I think we all need to thank the three presenters for this very exciting